Hi everyone, I am Katy Bass. I am the Research Director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Welcome to today's roundtable on lies and counterspeech. This is the fifth event the Knight Institute is hosting as part of a year-long exploration of lies and the law, spearheaded by our senior visiting research scholar, Genevieve Lakier. Genevieve is a law professor at the University of Chicago and an outstanding First Amendment scholar. This series of roundtable discussions she's hosted will reach its grand finale soon in April. On April 7th and 8th, we'll host a major symposium on lies, free speech, and the law at Columbia University. The symposium will feature new papers from prominent scholars of law, politics, and history. More details about the symposium are available on the Knight Institute's website, and you can also RSVP there. I want to welcome our panelists, Yochai, Amy, and David. Thank you all very much for joining us for this. Amy and David are both former Knight Institute senior visiting research scholars themselves, and I hope I can persuade Yochai to join us in a similar capacity in the future. For those in the audience, I want to let you know that each of the participants has written a brief reflection on some of the questions we'll be discussing today. They're really exceptionally good pieces, and I encourage you to read them. We'll put a link to those posts in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Genevieve. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you again to the fifth and last roundtable the Knight First Amendment Institute will be convening to explore from a variety of angles the relationship between lies and the law. As Katy noted, the topic of today's roundtable is counterspeech and whether counterspeech, either mandated or voluntary, can serve as an effective remedy to the problem of lies and deceptions in the public sphere. Now, the idea that counterspeech is a good solution, maybe the best solution, and maybe the only solution to the problems of lies and deception is a widely shared one today. For example, one of the primary responses of the social media platforms to anxiety about the spread of misinformation on the platforms has been to put warning labels on speech whose veracity is in question. Others have argued for the revival of the fairness doctrine in both traditional media and as applied to the social media platforms. Still others have argued that the government should fund a truth-committed public media that should fund good speech to crowd out the false speech. All of these solutions to what some have described as the epistemic crisis of truth we are currently facing presume, as Justice Kennedy put it in United States v. Alvarez, the most recent Supreme Court opinion dealing with the question of the First Amendment status of false speech, that the best remedy for speech that is false is speech that is true. But is that correct? Or is it, as one of our panelists provocatively put it in the short essay he wrote for this roundtable, simply another lie? And if so, what is there to do about it? And what does the First Amendment have to do with any of this anyway? Today, I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk through these difficult questions with some of the most interesting people thinking and writing about the problems of lies, truth, democracy, and counterspeech. Today, joining me in the roundtable are, in no particular order, Dave Posen, the Charles Keller Beekman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, and as Katy mentioned, a former senior visiting research scholar at the Knight Institute. Amy Kapczynski, Professor of Law at Yale Law School, and also, it's a bit of a reunion of sorts, former visiting research scholar at the Knight Institute. And Yochai Benkler, the Jack N. and Lillian R. Berkman Professor for Entrepreneurial Legal Studies at Harvard Law School, and perhaps a future Knight visiting research scholar at the Knight First Amendment Institute. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here today. Okay, so note on format. The plan today is not to organize things like an ordinary panel in which participants give pre-scripted remarks in a set order. Instead, the roundtable is intended to be conversational. I will get things going in a moment by asking a question for all of you to answer, but there are going to be no prepared comments or preset order. Ideas to help us think through the difficult questions of lies and counterspeech. So you should feel free to jump in, to disagree with one another, to engage as conversationally as possible. For those in the audience, you will have an opportunity at the end to ask questions of the panelists. Just put your question in the YouTube chat. All right, so to get things rolling, I thought I would start with a question for all three panelists based on the really excellent and provocative post you wrote for the roundtable, and all of which I'll note for the audience are available on the Knight First Amendment's website. So as I just noted, it's a fundamental truism of First Amendment law that, as Kennedy put it in Alvarez, the best remedy for bad speech, including false speech, is more speech. And although Kennedy articulated this in a relatively recent opinion in Alvarez, the idea that this is the way in which we deal with bad speech goes much, much further back. You can trace it all the way to Brandeis's really important concurring opinion in Whitney v. California, in which he articulates he makes essentially the same claim that Kennedy made in Alvarez. This claim, I think, underpins in many ways the entire modern First Amendment tradition. It is the reason why courts insist that limiting the government's ability to regulate speech in general will not undermine the search for truth, but to the contrary will aid it. It is this idea that, well, it will let 1,000 counter-speech flowers bloom. But all of you, to one extent or the other, cast serious doubt on whether this claim, this fundamental truism of First Amendment law, is true. Dave, I think you called it something like misinformation. Yochai, you suggested it's a fairy tale. So what does that mean for how we think about First Amendment law? Does that mean that the entire modern structure of the First Amendment is wrong? Or is the falsity of this truism a recent development, a product of recent changes to our information environment? And if so, what are those changes? So I thought I'd start with that very small, unimportant question. Dave, you're first on my screen. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Genevieve, for having me here, and it's an honor to be on this panel. I guess I want to say first that although I characterized Justice Kennedy's claim as misinformation itself, it doesn't necessarily condemn the whole architecture of First Amendment law to point out that a more open marketplace of ideas, or more speech overall, more true speech, reliably does not take down falsity. There are other values at play, of course. Justice Kennedy, I think, had some preface before his comment, like, in a free society, the best remedy for false speech is speech that is true, something to that effect. So he might have been invoking other democratic or deliberative values than the pursuit of truth to justify his strong reliance on counterspeech. Okay, so there are non-truth related justifications for preferring counterspeech to other regulatory solutions that I just took to be outside the scope of our prompt. But when it comes to the specific issue of inculcating true factual beliefs in society, I just don't think there is good evidence that a greater volume of true speech produces that effect. There's a great piece by Fred Schauer and Daniel Ho in the NYU Law Review that I linked to in my post that reviews what is now decades of research across multiple disciplines, all of which finds a complicated relationship, and in some cases a negative relationship, between a more open or less regulated marketplace of ideas and the ultimate amount of true belief in society, however exactly either side of that equation is measured. Lots of factors seem to influence whether there's uptake of true beliefs or not, that are kind of orthogonal to the amount of true speech out there. They include the identity and authority of the speaker, the perceived charisma of the message, the frequency with which a message is transmitted, people's prior beliefs and motivations, and on and on and on. So that it's just wrong to think that there's any straightforward relationship between the amount of counterspeech and the prevalence of truth in society at the end of the day. There are related literatures that I think also support skepticism. I mentioned a lot of literature now on how transparency policies across many domains have failed to produce their desired effects, which I think complements the Schauer and Ho piece and their findings, or really the evidence that they're summarizing. So that I hope, Genevieve, that answers the question of why I think Justice Kennedy could himself be said to be spreading misinformation when he recited that shibboleth about more speech leading to greater truth in the long run. Although I want to say I don't think it's fair to reduce his position to that proposition, insofar as he might have been making other points about the preferability of counterspeech on other grounds. I think a lot follows from the fact that more counterspeech doesn't reliably produce more truth in how we think about regulatory approaches, but maybe I should pause there for now.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, and I also want to come back to the really interesting idea that we might, the modern First Amendment doctrine might be best explained by something other than the pursuit of truth, non-truth supporting aims. I would imagine you're talking about maybe we might think of democracy aims and autonomy aims, although I want to come back to how separate those are from the pursuit of truth. Are all these distinct aims, or do we think that they're linked? But I want to just hear what Amy and Yochai have to say. Amy?
Great. Lovely to be here with you all. So, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Dave has said. I think if you think about how we act when we really want to find out what's true, right? We don't just sort of like let everybody shout and then, then the truth is going to come out, right? We actually structure inquiry. And so if you think about institutions that are designed to figure out what's true or what holds, they're very, very structured, right? And so, as I say in the blog post, like the courtroom, classic example, enormously structured. Like somebody with a gun will come take you away if you try to just go and, spread whatever your view is in the courtroom, right? Very, very structured approach to telling what happened, in part because the stakes are very high. But think also about the classroom or the way scientific inquiry works, right? We don't figure out whether vaccines work by let's just let everybody say whatever they want, and then the truth will come out. In fact, you have to do things like have clinical trials, and those clinical trials are enormously structured, and they're highly government regulated, actually, right? And so when we really invest in the question of figuring out what's true, or think about, is there voter fraud in the country, right? Like we have enormously structured inquiries and institutions that have practices that are in some sense auditable, right? Where we can then come to some agreement, hopefully, about what's true. And of course, that's hard. It's particularly hard in a highly polarized environment. So I think the sense of what's changed is, to some degree, I think, our broad kind of political economic moment and the kind of advance of neoliberalism, which is a term both Yochai and I use in our pieces, which we could talk more about, I think has both undercut the legitimacy of some of the institutions that we have historically relied upon, and also the power of some of those institutions, whether sort of taking down intermediaries like newspapers and sort of demoting them in their role in the ecosystem, or in part because of elite and partisan divides, making scientific knowledge itself, universities, other institutions that we've relied upon to help us figure out what holds. They're less trusted, right? I think it's features like that are in part in play behind the kind of great anxiety about how ill-informed the public is today. Of course, other changes in the media environment, which we're going to discuss, and I'm sure Yochai and Dave will have a lot to say about these too. But I think the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that there is something coming from the court that is somewhat new, which is, again, I associate it with a particular kind of way of thinking about the liberatory force of markets and the importance of sort of prioritizing market power and market sort of ideas or ideology over other ways of thinking about things like speech that mean that, for example, the court's gotten much more deregulatory in certain spaces, commercial speech being one, campaign finance another, right? They've really pushed the sort of idea that we need to free the marketplace of speech and taken apart some institutions we had that I think were helpfully not necessarily openly discussed by First Amendment law, but that actually helped mean that the sort of story that, well, we don't need regulation, well, because newspapers and universities and other kinds of things are regulating, like you're not regulating, made that story make some sense. And some of that's changing. And I think the other piece that I'm quite concerned about is the degree to which transitions in both First Amendment law, but also in private law, like, for example, the law of trade secrecy, actually make private control, corporate control over speech and knowledge production and who has what kind of information more secure and make us less well informed. And so, of course, that's part of the story of what's going on in Facebook and Twitter and like who has what kind of control over our information environment, how much private concentrated control there is of that. But also, can we disclose what Facebook does? How do their algorithms actually work? What do we know? That's actually much harder than it might have been, I think, given in some earlier periods of how we thought about constitutional law and trade secrecy law because of some of these changes in doctrine that have happened in recent years.
So, Amy, do I hear you saying, I mean, I hear echoes with Dave, but also differences insofar as you're suggesting that counterspeech can, in fact, be useful. It's just all counterspeech is not the same. We need to think about the agent, the institution, and I suppose the practices of knowledge production that produce the counterspeech. Because I think of, academia, the world in which I operate, as organized around a whole set of practices of speech and counter-speech. You write an article and then 5 people write another article to smash you down. But they do it through highly organized and often hierarchical systems of knowledge production. But it's still, we might think, counter-speech, but it's not the idea of just the person on the street corner rebutting whatever the speaker is saying.
I think that's right. And I bet Dave would also agree that sort of allowing critique and alternative points of view is important. But I think what's not logical is to associate that with a certain way of thinking about the free market, like just anything goes, and therefore the truth will emerge through this invisible hand sort of idea. In fact, I don't even think that's how markets work, but that's another story.
Okay, Yochai?
Let's see if I can be non-repetitive. There's a problem when all three of us agree so much. So let me actually pick up, Genevieve, on your last point, which is, what is, after all, the role of speech and of structures of contestation? We certainly have a view of truth that involves opening things up for contesting speech. I think your example of academia is just right. That's the whole point of academic freedom and our persistence in it. I think if I read both Dave and Amy's posts and my own, we were reacting to the particular role of the assertion about the role of counterspeech in the ideology of the First Amendment as it's developed over the last century, not as a political structural provision that is first and foremost anti-authoritarian and reflects a rejection of the government declaring what is orthodox, and trying to calm ourselves. And don't forget, it comes from a period of high modernism where we do imagine that there's an objective truth, and we do arrive at it by careful inquiry, trying to calm ourselves that there are no conflicts between committing to an anti-authoritarian view of the First Amendment, preserving democracy in such a way, and arriving at truth. But there are conflicts. And we're living through a period of such conflicts, but we have that in all our systems. We pretend that the jury is a way of getting to the truth, even though we know that our entire criminal procedure is set up to produce a systematic system of misstatements of the truth, of false convictions, because we bring experts into it to speak, using Amy's comparison we bring experts to testify in person, even though it's much more objective and reasonable to assess them based on reading mutual comparisons. And we leave lay people sitting in a jury box to be emotionally affected by who is dressed nicely, who isn't dressed nicely, who looks nice, who doesn't. And we systematically put people in prison mistakenly. So we sacrifice a lot more on the altar of this supposed pursuit of truth in pursuit of other things. In the First Amendment context, the particular danger, in this regard, I think I overlap closely with Amy. The particular danger is the overlap of this idea, the specific one you used from Justice Kennedy, invoking the marketplace of ideas that kind of combines the falsely idealized view of the market as somehow clearing consumer preferences, which is not what it does, with a false sense that open speech in an open democratic society will also lead that society to the true results of belief. Also, always false. So I think that was the source of the reaction. It's a reaction to an overbearing ideology that is a lie both about market relations and about political relations.
It's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting response, because I will say, when I read both your and Dave's posts, I kept trying to think about how they stand in relation to the deregulatory First Amendment cases that Amy was referencing. You know, I think over the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen a wholesale deregulation of disclosure. I mean, we've seen a very deregulatory First Amendment flex its muscles in all different domains. One of the primary areas where we are seeing this is when it comes to mandated disclosure or speech laws. So, for example, if we think about the crisis pregnancy case, Nifla v. Becerra, where the court strikes down a California law that requires these centers for pregnant people, the law required that they disclose that the state of California provides abortion and other subsidized maternal prenatal services on the grounds that this is an intrusion on the market autonomy, the speech autonomy of the clinics. There's a way in which the idea that counterspeech doesn't work fits nicely into or echoes, maybe reinforces, or might be said to reinforce the view taken in that case, which is that the government is not achieving anything much here. We don't need mandated disclosures; are not the way to go. Maybe requiring more speech is not a solution to problems of, in that case, the concern was fraud and deception. The court has, I think, despite what Kennedy said in Alvarez, has taken a very dim look at government-required counterspeech. And so, Yochai, like Amy, you spoke about, you're critical of neoliberalism, but one might imagine one part of the neoliberal First Amendment has been to make it extremely difficult for the government to mandate counterspeech, to mandate disclosure laws when we have market relations of inequality. And so I guess I would like to hear more about what you think about those cases and that sort of whole line of deregulatory jurisprudence. Either you or Dave.
I'll come in briefly. Don't forget, the author of the Powell memo is appointed in order to allow business to pollute the environment with falsehood that support their bottom line. He is the origin of making commercial speech not regulable. He is the author of corporate speech. So you take the Powell memo, and then within 5 years you have Virginia Pharmacy Board, and then within another 4 years you have Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, and you understand the project is not truth. The project is getting government out of the field of constraining business manipulation of the information environment against any efforts to constrain profit seeking. That's the underlying project. Then it has all sorts of spin-offs that have to do with the particular coalition that the Party of Business cobbled together. But that's the driving force, is to get the state out of the way of being able to pollute the information ecosystem in ways that get in the way of profit.
Well, I'll just add on. I'll just say that I think your question, Genevieve, and Yochai's response goes to the kind of ambiguity in the framing of being pro counterspeech or against counterspeech. There's Justice Kennedy. I think in my post I used the phrase is invoking a let everyone speak model. A libertarian or we could say neoliberal model of the production of counterspeech, which is essentially just let everyone say what they wish. And was much more hostile to, and the court has been much more hostile to, something closer to what Amy was describing, which is a highly regulated or structured environment, what I call in my post the debating club model of counterspeech, where the state comes in to set the conditions under which the counterspeech is going to happen in a way that's thought to be conducive to truth or other values. So that I think picks up some of the hostility of the court to the regulations you're describing. I suggest at the end of my post that, for reasons that resonate with what Amy said, however, the more regulated versions of counterspeech are likely to be more effective at combating falsity, and not necessarily because better ideas or truer ideas tend to convince more people and debunk or defang, the sting of the initial lie. That may be one possible mechanism by which counterspeech works, and that's the idealized version of how the marketplace works. But I think just as likely in a lot of situations, speakers are less likely to lie or say inflammatory or hard to defend things in the first place, because they know that a certain form of counterspeech is coming whether it's the fairness doctrine or through a disclosure requirement. And so they modify their behavior ex ante to avoid a certain kind of confrontation. That's a more unnerving story, I think, of how counterspeech works from a First Amendment perspective, because it's really the chilling or the sensorial effects of the counterspeech regime that is doing the work of reducing falsity, not more speech winning out in the end. And then there's yet a third mechanism by which counterspeech, I think, might combat falsity, and that goes to the very business models that are used to produce the speech in the first place. So if broadcast media or the clinics in the Becerra case are less likely to operate in a certain way or have a certain aesthetic or be as outrage fueled in their business models as they were because they have to let on an opposing viewpoint, that too changes the environment for the reception of the speech in ways that may promote truth, but not necessarily, again, because more ideas are getting out there and people are ultimately going to see the light. So I think the ways in which counterspeech actually works best in the public sphere don't necessarily conform to the academic environment in which we hope that when someone publishes a decisive refutation of a prior paper, people see that the latter argument is stronger. I think often in the spaces we're talking about, counterspeech works because speakers don't say the same things as or say them as outrageously, or they don't get as much traction, not because of the purifying properties of the counterspeech itself.
Just to say one thing about the abortion example, I think that one of the things that's so outrageous about that case is that we know that women are misled by these crisis pregnancy centers and the way that they're advertised. And so the case sort of could have drawn upon, in fact, a long tradition in First Amendment law that says, actually, people are misled all the time in commercial settings. And the government is perfectly able to say, this must be said, this must not be said. That's what essentially an enormous amount of the regulatory state does, right? Because we know that in contexts like business contexts, and I think Dave is right to point us to, in political context, we've done it a bit differently, although it's not obvious that's because of truth. It's to serve other values, right? It's perfectly obvious that in commercial settings, people are misled all the time, and that we regulate speech all the time. You know, you have to say how many calories there are in things, because guess what? Humans aren't really good at figuring that out, and they constantly think they're less, right? We regulate all kinds of things to keep people from being misled. And there was a very good factual basis to think that was a circumstance in which people were being misled. And yet, I think, and this is where it comes to, I think the court's project is absolutely deregulatory in a sort of neoliberal sense, but it's also wrapped in, the abortion exception, right? Like, why would that case not look like commercial speech, but looks like, government speech or political speech? So it's because of how the court's filters about these political issues, I think, come into play, and how complex and manipulable the doctrine actually is. And of course, the court is also taking down like the commercial speech traditions that would have allowed and do allow still mandatory disclosures and so forth. They're not completely gone, but certainly they're being undermined as well. But that case went even beyond it, and I think that has to do with other kind of political valences that are on the court's mind in a case like that.
Yeah, I mean, Amy, I have to agree 100% with all of that. I mean, I've written that I like the commercial speech line of cases when it comes to the First Amendment, because it's one of the areas of doctrine where we see the court recognizing, albeit we might think in overly narrow ways, the ways in which disclosure might, the existence of power inequalities between the seller and the buyer of a commercial product, because the seller, the cases recognize, has information about the product that the buyer usually doesn't have and doesn't have access to. And in that context, allows there to be more disclosure in order to remedy this power imbalance. And so we might think disclosure is the commercial speech cases are one of the only areas, I think, in First Amendment law where a kind of incipient power analysis is present even a little bit. And the narrowing of the court's increasingly tough line on disclosure, even in the commercial speech context, I think is a really powerful indication of how this latent, still very latent, but visible notion of inequalities in status and power and inequalities in the possession of knowledge is being leached out of the doctrine. And I find that very distressing. I thought Becerra's, you're right, maybe it goes further than the other cases because of the abortion context, but it is emblematic of a broader tendency we're seeing in First Amendment law, where disclosure is being cast aside because of the view that everyone's on an even playing field, and why are you going to impose a cost on one speaker when the other person, it's their job to figure things out. But all of that presumes that disclosures do something. The Becerra is only awful if we think that this mandated extra speech to counterspeech. This essentially what the Becerra case is doing is it's California intruding counterspeech into this relationship between the crisis pregnancy center and the patient or the potential patient. That was the purpose of the law. And so if counterspeech doesn't work in this way, maybe we shouldn't care about that case. Maybe, it looks bad, but so what?
I think Dave is right that it doesn't work nearly as well as we'd like it to, right? And we know this he cited some of these studies, right? That consumers often ignore disclosures, and that it takes a lot more than a simple disclosure to put people in a position, in fact, to address some of the power imbalances or otherwise to make other kinds of choices, right? But I don't think to say that is to say that disclosures can never matter, or that we shouldn't be disturbed by a very aggressive move by some government actors, in this case the Supreme Court, to say certain kinds of information will not be shared, even if, on consideration, using all the tools we have to think about how we know what's true and who people are and how they work, we can't make a decision that, in fact, disclosures in this context would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll just add to that although I think I quote Omri Ben-Shahar and Carl Schneider from their classic piece, The Failure of Mandated Disclosure, saying that it chronically fails. There's a little more nuance in the empirical findings, and some forms of targeted transparency policies seem at least somewhat more effective than others. I wonder if in the abortion example, it was the disclosures that the state of California wanted to mandate that the court struck down would have, again, kind of changed the whole tenor of the relationship of the person seeing them with the entity, and worked at that level more than introducing new factual information, which changed decision making. But I can't help but point out that there's a real irony in the conservative justices' turn against disclosure as a kind of compelled speech, at least in the corporate space, because as scholars like Amanda Shaynor have detailed in their scholarship, when transparency policies became ascendant in the regulation of consumer law and business law in the 70s and 80s, they were touted by pro-business conservatives who contrasted them with hard forms of regulation, command and control regulation that would outright prohibit certain practices. So you simply cannot source conflict minerals, say, in your supply chain. The practice is banned. That was hard regulation and considered too market intrusive. The better, lighter touch approach to regulating in these spaces, conservatives argued in the 80s, was transparency, which would be less disruptive to the operation of the market, and people could make more informed decisions. And if they saw that the product was made of conflict minerals, they could choose not to buy it. And I use that example because conservative judges on the DC circuit would have struck down a rule that would have required the disclosure of conflict minerals, again, rather than an outright ban. So the sense in which the goalposts have shifted, where having successfully dismantled substantive regulation that would have more directly attacked the problems we're talking about, of inequality, of fraud, of abusive behaviors of all sorts, having transparency was used to dismantle that structure of regulation, and now all we're left with in a lot of areas is transparency, and now that's under attack on these First Amendment grounds. So this is it's hard for me to even take how far we've moved from the conversation in the 1970s and 80s, and that transparency is now being demonized by the right as too intrusive in the market, when that was its very justification to crowd out what in many areas would have been more effective forms of regulation in the first place.
But, Dave, your comments made me think that political shift, ideological shift, or I guess we could say dance, where transparency keeps moving, may help explain why, I guess, pro-regulatory or more progressive scholars, free speech scholars, including myself, have embraced the idea of sort of disclosures as an important mechanism for adjusting or remedying or mediating power imbalances in the marketplace. So 20 years ago, people might have, the sort of people on the left would have scoffed at this because it's not substantive regulation, but now it is what there is, and it is now under attack. But your posts all push against thinking of that as a primary mechanism, I suppose, although maybe we can complicate that now. Maybe it depends on the context. Disclosure or mandated transparency of certain sorts as a primary response to the systemic inequalities in the market and in other domains. And I suppose I want to go back to this idea. Amy brought it up, but it's also in Yochai's post, and to some degree in Dave's, that instead of having the sort of this individualized capacity to counterspeak, we want to have a more regulated set of institutions that are producing knowledge or truth through more disciplined and organized measures or counterspeech. And to just push on that a little bit, because I guess what I was wondering is this an anti-democratic solution? So, Yochai, I think you used the term elite institutions or experts we can trust. And there is an extent to which, as Dave was suggesting, anytime we are going to be talking about this more regulated set of knowledge and speech-producing institutions, like the university, like maybe the scientific research community, there is going to be some extent to which we are not just enabling speech, but we're also restricting speech because we're allowing certain people, certain kinds of institutions, and certain kinds of processes to be the authorized speakers and not others, right? There are all set sorts of credentialing and gatekeeping involved in the production of expert knowledge always. So it's both about the production of speech and also the limitation of speech of who can speak. And right from the beginning, from Dave's comments, Dave, you suggested that there are multiple values at stake here, and we might think that beside from the value of truth, there is this democratic value. So are these in opposition here? I mean, if we think that the best way to remedy falsity is through the production of elite knowledge, is there a tension between a kind of underlying democratic value, everyone gets to have their truth, and this commitment to truth?
I mean, one of the reasons I end my piece talking about rebuilding public universities and public institutions of education is that I think there is a tension. I think there is honestly a tension, and I think it's worse when our institutions are more hierarchical, less accessible, and less trusted. And we're in one of those moments, I think, where there's certainly the exposure of how profoundly our elite institutions, whether they're the scientific production or the universities, are affected by the rise of the 1% and the legacy admits and all of those things. And I think people are deeply resentful, and rightly so, of how closed those institutions are to people and perhaps by extension, certain kinds of points of view or ways of thinking about the world. And so I think you have to think about that problem at the same time. The answer isn't necessarily to throw the question of whether vaccines work to like everybody standing, in Union Square. I think that's not that's not a democratic answer to what do vaccines work. It doesn't help democracy to ask everybody in Union Square whether or not vaccines work, right? And so I think you have to think about the question of sort of democratizing these institutions and making them less elite. I think that and not all institutions of knowledge production have those qualities in the same kind of way. I think that, there are, part of what, at least how I think about it, is that knowledge production takes real effort and it takes real investment. And we don't have that many institutions that are empowered and funded to do this kind of work. We should be funding more local journalism, not big outfits, but small outfits, right? We should be providing more avenues for people to analyze, information and data, whether through journalism or through research and scientific enterprises, citizen science, things like that. I think that could make some difference in the dynamic that you're talking about, without imagining that, Union Square is the place to resolve all great questions of truth.
So it's a very interesting exchange, Genevieve, between you and Amy. I wonder to what extent part of the problem is the usage democratize to mean anarchic, that which is without order. And I think it's important not to confound the two. Rush Limbaugh, for decades, told his listeners that they should ignore the four corners of deceit: government, academia, science, and the media. That is to say, the four major groups in modernism and high modernism who developed internal governance structures to order the production and revision of beliefs about the state of the world, about the likely dynamics in the world. He tried to liberate his listeners from these ordered structures of truth production and self-criticism in order to make it easier to replace them with alternative facts. And you just have to think of a simple question. Would it be democratizing to have the unemployment rate, labor force participation, and inflation rate be produced by major media outlets that are commercial instead of by a really internally ordered, legally insulated body like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Census Bureau? And I think the answer to that is no, right? You don't want every month, every week, every month to have to open Fox News and Breitbart and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and find slightly differing or very differing calculations, which end up being exactly uncomfortable for the opposing party in power. So I think if we think of democracy as some sense of freedom from authoritarianism and the capacity for effective self-governance based on a broadly plausible best of currently available information about the state of the world, we need publicly funded, not commercial, just like we do with basic science, just like we do with basic economic data, just like we do with basic data, weather data. Markets are bad at producing information. They're not good at producing information, or at least market-oriented, profit-seeking organizations. We need ordered production of knowledge with sufficient diversity and transparency. I'm not trying to be a naive here. In order to enable meaningful self-governance on the background of something like a plausible set of understandings. I don't think that lack of trust in elites is because we have democratized information. Lack of trust in elites is because elites betrayed most people and left them most miserable and economically insecure, and rejected their sense of identity and their sense of economic well-being without replacing it with something that they were willing to live with. Some people, there are some improvements in freedom, people are confused because their lives are miserable.
I'll just briefly, I agree with, I think pretty much everything that's been said just now by Yohai and Amy. We'll just add that, so we continue not to do a great job at eliciting counterspeech that would
Counterspeech clearly doesn't work because I'm not hearing any of it here. I'm gonna try, but okay, go.
It may just be, I talk at the end of my post about how we're in this dilemma. What counts as misinformation in the first place, is in many circumstances itself unclear. I think many aspects of the COVID situation speak to that. Maybe not vaccine efficacy, but issues around vaccine policy. So the idea, what counts as misinformation, is both central to any strategy that would regulate it, but is itself a joint production of knowledge and politics. And our politics are such that it's hard to achieve any kind of broad socio-epistemic consensus on what's misinformation. So it might work to reduce falsity if you radically curtail the speech environment, ban social media, but that would run headlong into into democratic values. It's unthinkable in terms of liberal democracy and communicative capitalism. Can't countenance a shutdown of social media or something. So what we're really talking about are much more piecemeal moves that would denigrate this or that idea or argument, but under conditions of the kind of lack of public trust that Yochai was invoking, and the wreckage of neoliberalism that Amy was invoking. It's really hard to see how a lot of these piecemeal strategies are going to heal social fracture and misinformation rather than exacerbate it and make people even more distrustful of what's happening. This is not the most constructive point I'm making as far as where to go, but I think it speaks to how we may not have the right preconditions to be able to tackle the lies that we're talking about through any number of small bore strategies. And so it's interesting that both Amy and Yochai are kind of panning out from the prompt of the discussion to talk about rebuilding public infrastructure and democratic equality much more broadly. And I read them as saying that that's we can't even hope to make headway on the problem of lies and misinformation without approaching some of those deeper drivers.
Yeah, I mean, I find it really fascinating. The argument for counterspeech is, as you all noted in your blog post, usually a justification for a deregulatory conception of freedom of speech. And I think the conversation here is pushing towards a pro-regulatory conception of freedom of speech or truth or the good, the no lies society that we are trying to imagine, where there's a lot of positive effort that is required. You have to create the institutions, you have to create the set of systems of knowledge production necessary to have the capacity to drive out lies through these forms of institutions, elite or otherwise. But and I think that's very interesting. I'm very sympathetic to it. But I guess it triggers two reactions in me. One is, how nostalgic is this? So one of the characteristics, you might say, one of the major shifts that has occurred in the organization and infrastructure of the mass public sphere over, say, the last 50 years, is it has become increasingly less organized around gatekeepers. It has become democratized for good or for ill. And so, for example, the institutional press plays much less of a significant role in gatekeeping than it once did. We might think the medical profession has much less authority over the production of medical truth for good or for ill than it once did. A lot of set of elite institutions have really been undermined, we might think, both by neoliberalism and by the transformation of the public sphere in general. But that doesn't strike me as entirely bad. There were a lot of problems with the gatekeepers of the 40s and 50s. I mean, if we think just about academia or we think about the press, two really important institutions for truth production, they were organized, limited, constrained to produce certain kinds of truth and leave out others. I mean, I'm thinking about Chomsky's work here on everything that wasn't coming into the mainstream press in the 50s. So I guess, one question is, how do we ensure that a more institutionally organized public sphere, in which it's not up to the random individual standing on the street corner, but up to these positive institutions to create truth, is in fact not excluding important voices. And then second, just and this goes to, I think, Yochai's blog post the most. Yochai, you suggest that the real commitment of the First Amendment is an anti-authoritarian one, that's how we should understand the First Amendment, more than about the search for truth, because it does a bad job of promoting the search for truth. That's what you're all suggesting, at least as it's currently understood, or other commitments. It's really about anti-authoritarianism. But of course, the anti-authoritarian tendencies of the First Amendment are one of the reasons why there's been a lot of hesitation to allowing the government to play a role in creating these kinds of truth-producing institutions. There's a lot of anxiety about the role that the government plays in all of this. So is this an anti-authoritarian vision? And what role should the government play in this sort of more structured, institutionally organized public sphere? Sorry, a lot there. Thoughts, reactions?
As you say, there's a lot there. It's a very rich set of comments. First of all, I want to make clear that by saying that ordered, publicly funded institutions are better at producing a more disciplined set of statements about what we could plausibly describe as truth, I am not calling for more government regulation, therefore. There's a big difference between setting up structures that are insulated from the dynamics of profit seeking by being publicly funded and government censorship. In fact, it is the mark of a successful public institution that it receives a steady flow of funds that is secure from both political intervention and market manipulation. So whether it's the BBC, whether it's basic science research that is governed by the community of scholars through peer review with broad set amount funded and broad direction, like more cancer research, less something else in different periods. But you have structures of relation between government and non-government, publicly oriented, non-market organizations that are oriented by their own internal institutional structures towards truth-seeking. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I kind of made a career out of saying that old-style media was bad and we're better off with a democratized media. So I'm in no position to push back against that. But again, that doesn't mean there's not an important room for publicly funded, independent, professional media in that kind of a more diversified environment. So if you look at the Reuters Institute reports, annual reports on levels of false beliefs in various forms and mistrust around the world, you see that places that have very strong public media like Germany, even though they have a right wing, even though there's a right wing with a lot of disinformation flowing online, at a broad population level, people are not disoriented. They're not in an epistemic crisis, they're under pressure. It's a big difference. So of course, and I say it in the blog post, the Walter Cronkite is not something to yearn back to, because it wasn't that wasn't the way it was then either. My primary focus was that the enormous amount of energy going into solving online disinformation, funding fact-checking, funding various kinds of this new organization that will go online and produce a lot of philanthropic funding, including very much by Knight and their leadership on this, is going towards the margins of the problem. The foundations of distrust are not a radically decentralized information environment. They're about social dynamics internally. There is a room for publicly funded, non-market oriented information production. It's absolutely central to the functioning of a democratic society. It is complemented very well by radically decentralized information production and works best when you have both. At the moment, we don't, because of the particular politics and the ways and the political economy of the media ecosystem beginning in the 70s. That's why we have this large, powerful political segment that is insulated and has been by a process that's been going on for 40 years from every single non-market body in society that has adopted institutional constraints on its ability to disconnect itself from reality.
I mean, I guess I would just say, push back a little bit. I mean, that's all very sympathetic to me. But on the point of
I mean, I think I'll say something and then you can jump in. I think one thing about the example that you choose, for example, doctors, is that in fact, professional societies are the ones that mediate, and maybe not so well, but that mediate whether doctors are, effectively lose their licenses or not. And it's backstopped by state power. But what's very interesting as somebody who studies science and science policy, as I do, is that a lot of science and science policy is heavily funded by the state. And in fact, and regulated, but in a way that involves a certain establishment of distance, right? So there are professional norms and societies and groups that are delegated a certain amount of authority and that aren't. And so this is actually inherent, I think, in the very idea of the university. There's a beautiful book about the creation of the modern research university, which comes from Europe and Germany, actually, that talks about how important it was that the university be indirectly useful to the state and directly useless. Right? And there's a certain kind of mediated relationship that I think is quite important to in fact, the dynamics of good knowledge production. And it's going to be different in different contexts, right? And I think that's one thing that's hard about sort of universalizing a rule about how the state can regulate or not. And it's one of the things that's wrong with a statement like the free market is always the right way to do this, right? That when you look at these systems, they're actually quite intricately designed, the ones that work. And so there is state authority, but it's designed in a particular way to not, Congress doesn't tell the NIH what to research. That's kind of interesting because they certainly tell a lot of government, like agencies what to do in a very particular way, but they don't tell the NIH that. And they don't defrock individual doctors, for example, because if so, there'd probably be lots of Democrats running for office that would be being defrocked in all kinds of, state legislatures around the country, and maybe vice versa. So I think it's those design things that are actually quite important. Also thinking about how public media institutions work. They are not designed so that they're immediately answerable to figures in politics. And I think it's understanding some of that architecture that's quite important.
Yochai, did you want to
add? Amy said everything that was important to say. One small thing. Anything you design, assume that over the next 20 years, there's some non-zero probability that the government official will be a Rudy Giuliani or a Michael Flynn.
So the suggestion being that the design better be quite intricate. Sorry, go Dave.
No, this was not as a criticism to Amy. This was directly in response to you need a government person to do this. If you don't have institutions that insulate of the kind that Amy described, we're going to be in deep trouble at some point.
I was just going to say that Yochai is directing our attention to, and Amy, to the away from the margins and toward the more fundamental drivers of disinformation and distrust, and therefore towards solutions like a BBC for this country, or a renewed commitment to public education, maybe a renovation of the Republican Party. But I wonder, Genevieve, whether you think this is responsive to the immediate prompt and problem at hand. All those kinds of solutions, which will be congenial to a certain sort of progressive, are kind of multi-generational projects of civic renewal. And right now, there's this flood of disinformation, on Facebook and Twitter, and so we may need a mixed approach. I'll just say I really don't feel like I have a clear sense of what would be the best short-term solution for the circulation of misinformation on a particular platform, except that I'm wary of fact checks, warning labels, and the like, in light of what we know from the experience with mandated disclosure in other contexts. But Genevieve, if I could turn it to you, a kind of an intermediate solution between, the pure transparency strategy or pure count, of like a warning label, and the broad gauge, program of, public media that Yochai is invoking, is something like the fairness doctrine. I think. And your colleague Brian Leiter at Chicago had this piece he posted recently, which seemed to get a lot of attention, calling for a fairness doctrine for internet platforms. And I was looking to see whether you had weighed in on that as his colleague. I'm guessing you're skeptical, but can I ask you whether you think there's hope for something like the fairness doctrine as a kind of intermediate regulatory solution?
Well, two thoughts, one practical and one more theoretical. And I think your question poses, well, there's two sets of really interesting implications of your question that I want to turn back on the panelists, because you're subverting the power relations here, Dave. I don't know what you think you're doing. You think we're in a terrain of equality? Okay. Okay, so the first thing is I don't really know how a fairness doctrine would work in social media, because the whole presumption of the fairness doctrine is that there's a scarce amount of space that has to be allocated by a primary agent. The fairness doctrine I'm incredibly skeptical of as a solution to anything much, because on my view, the fairness doctrine is really a band-aid that the government imposed after it gave away the airwaves to almost entirely commercial entities. So what we have in the early 1920s is we have a really incredibly diverse broadcast landscape that then gets regularized under the pretext of the government allocating what is public airwaves, but really almost all of the allocations go to commercial broadcasters. The commercial broadcasters then have, for very familiar profit-oriented reasons, decide to advance a relatively narrow set of ideas and points of view, and born on the backs of advertising considerations. And in response to this, the sort of advocates for a more democratic and more public-spirited broadcast push for something like the fairness doctrine, which is always enforced very loosely and is used sort of as the exception rather than the rule. So I guess the first reaction is those people who are nostalgic for the fairness doctrine. I'm not sure exactly what you're nostalgic for. It is it's what we had. We might query whether it did much good to begin with. But as you suggest in your post, and I think as Brian says in his paper, we might think that the fairness doctrine is correlated with the end of the fairness doctrine is correlated with the rise of Rush Limbaugh and the emergence of talk radio. There's a lot of questions about how important a role it played, how strong the causal link is, but certainly it's suspicious. And there's no doubt that what the fairness doctrine did was it constrained the ability of radio and then ultimately television broadcasters to operate in particular ways. It imposed a certain set of civility norms on the radio and then the television that was hated by right-wing radio that wanted to speak in a different way. And so I guess if we leave aside the practical question of like, what would it look like on social media where there's no set of scarce resources that are allocated, like I genuinely don't know what a fairness doctrine would look like practically in social media, but let's imagine we could have a rule that if Facebook amplifies a set of right-wing posts, it has to amplify a set of left-wing posts. Well, first of all, I'm skeptical. I'm doubtful about how effective or how significant, whether this would simply be operating at the margins. But the deeper question is, as you suggest, do we think that that result, which would be the chilling of speech, the reason the fairness doctrine was so hated by the right is it did chill a certain form of expression, this form of expression that didn't want to brook the other side, that wanted to have nonstop talk radio on a particular point of view. Is that chilling of speech a necessary partner to the this production of good speech that I think Amy and Yochai are talking about? And in your post, you suggest that maybe limits on speech, chilling of speech is a necessary way. If we have so much speech and there's so much bad speech, if we're adding a little bit good speech, publicly funded, orderly, good speech, but it doesn't have a kind of authority, epistemic authority, then are we doing any good? Maybe we do need to limit the range of speech available. But I'm wary of that, I guess, because I do have anti-authoritarian tendencies. And if we look at the history of the fairness doctrine in its core understanding is a representation of the highly gatekeepered notion of the public sphere that I don't want to be nostalgic for, where there was this idea that there were a certain set of, and this is in the early articulation of the fairness doctrine, respectable voices that deserve to be heard on the broadcast media, and who decides what the respectable voices are. So that seems to me something very different from the kind of intricately designed, highly mediated set of knowledge institutions that Amy's talking about. You're right, though, maybe it would be easier and more immediate than creating a whole set of new institutions, but I'm really wary of it. But I'd be curious to hear what Yochai and Amy have thoughts on fairness doctrine or on fact-checking, which I have to say is the closest we come to a kind of solution in the contemporary period, which looks a little bit like the more ordered forms of counterspeech that I think Amy and Yochai are talking about, because the fact-checkers they're not, it's not sort of as intricately designed as other forms of professional knowledge production, but the whole point of the fact-checking is that there is some sort of order imposed on the delimitation of truth and falsity. And yet you're right, there's a lot of evidence that fact-checking doesn't do much good. So, Yochai, Amy, fairness doctrine, fact-checking, chilling of speech.
Yochai.
Should we limit what can be, what people can say?
So, a couple of words on the fairness doctrine, and even fewer on fact-checking. A small plug for the relevant chapter in Network Propaganda, where I make a very particular claim about the role of the fairness doctrine in liberating Rush Limbaugh's business model. I think it comes at a very particular moment and requires a combination of technological changes, particularly ground-to-satellite transmission for national redistribution, the deregulation of FM radio that left AM having to find a non-music format. More importantly, the proving of the audience by Pat Robertson and the televangelists of there being an unserved audience in exactly that moment of dramatic expansion of channels. But it's true that Rush Limbaugh didn't start right then, but he got syndicated within months after the repeal of the fairness doctrine because it radically reduced the cost to any given radio station to air him. It turned him into, it took this extremely cheap format, one guy sitting and mouthing off in front of a mic, and reduced its primary cost, which was then you'd have to dedicate time to somebody else. And so it was a fantastic solution for AM radio, which had a real problem once music shifted to FM. And it played a critical role, but you don't get to rewind history, right? The fact that it was important, let's say for a moment that it was important precisely by suppressing this outrage format on radio and over-the-air television. You still don't get to rewind when nobody uses over-the-air anymore except for radio. Now, are there certain things you could do? You could dramatically decrease the group ownership rules so as to make a model like Sinclair or iHeart that owns Premier Radio that also runs all of the talk radio coast to coast 24 hours a day, and just put some, in terms of structural regulation, make it less profitable, make it more expensive, clunkier. You could do that without running afoul, I think, of the First Amendment, unless you write a memo that says I'm doing it for this purpose. So that's the first thing. But again, I think the nostalgia towards the First Amendment is very much a nostalgia toward a teeny weeny tiny itsy bitsy period in American history when progressive judges had enough power and were not yet captured by neoliberalism, so they were able, like in Red Lion, to say, yes, there is such a thing as private censorship. Concentrated economic power is a form of power over information, and the government shouldn't countenance censorship, whether by a private or a public actor. That's a very brief moment in which the judiciary within the First Amendment doctrine was willing to countenance the idea that private economic power could be a source of censorship cognizable by the First Amendment. Jerry Barron tried to build on it. He brought Tornillo, and it killed the movement. Not it. The Nixon-appointed court killed the movement, shifting away as it did. So I think the fairness doctrine is an appropriate nostalgia for a moment at which we could imagine having a constitutional law that comprehended private power as an important dimension of constitutional adjudication. Frank Michelman was writing about welfare rights. There's this moment. But that's all it is. It's just nostalgia for a moment where progressive judges, after so many Democratic judges, plus the defections of Brennan and Warren, gave progressives a sense that the court was with us. But it's not. That was the only short little time that the court has been anything other than a conservative force in American politics. All of that said, the fairness doctrine won't survive 3 minutes in the McConnell court, because the entire direction of the First Amendment, the Lochnerization of the First Amendment, it just won't survive. The moment it gets to the McConnell court, it's dead. So I worry about putting political energies in a dead end.
I'll say one thing just to add to that, which is that I think implicit and maybe explicit in what Yochai was saying was that the fairness doctrine in certain iterations was built around a recognition that speech is structured by power. And so that there are ways to say the speech environment should look like this that are engaged in sort of creating countervailing power, as opposed to, suppressing and repressing and censoring, right? And so if we accept the sort of basic, read that like any form of interference is suppression and censorship, then I think we don't allow ourselves to develop the kinds of analysis that we should be nostalgic for, which is an analysis that can think about power, right? And so, I'm thinking here of the way that the courts talk about unions these days, right? Which is like no recognition that there could be reasons for saying unions ought to be able to speak, and we ought to, have structures that allow us to fund unions so that they can speak. Because those are forms of countervailing power, right? I'm thinking about decisions like Janus, right? Or drawing on what Yochai was saying, that say, there are certain kinds of incentives in the private sector that we should counteract. Because, of course, that's true. And I don't think of the current moment as a radically decentered media environment. And I do think there are scarce resources. It's scarcity of attention more than it is of any sort of speech. And they're incredibly centralized, right? And so I think we would need to be able to begin from a kind of analysis about what's wrong with that environment that doesn't just simply sort of turn on censorship, not censorship, because there's already censorship. There's already power being exercised. We have to theorize what a more democratic way of distributing power would be, and therefore who has to be given authority. And we've got pieces here and there in this conversation, more public institutions of knowledge creation, more public media. I do think that there are probably analogs to something like the fairness doctrine. What's interesting now, because of the McConnell court, is we're creating them outside of government regulation, because there's no point in trying to do it through government regulation. And so people beat up on Facebook and they try to create institutional responses on that will, in fact, address the fact that there are enormously powerful, organized activity going on Facebook to try to spread misinformation. It's all being funneled into private governance because that's what our constitutional tradition at this point demands. I think what's sad is that is the only place where I think we start to see people working out a power analysis and trying to figure out how do you regulate against the backdrop of that. And it's entirely unaccountable and largely, I think, not even recognized as such.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. So someone wants to ask about political speech. That we've been surprisingly quiet about political speech, political truth and falsity. So how do we think about the problem of lies when it comes to political speech? Do the solutions that we've been talking about, do they apply in the political realm, or are they about other forms of speech, other forms of truth?
Maybe I'll just say quickly. I mean, I think that political speech exacerbates the problem of identifying what is a lie or misinformation in a way that's objective and it's sufficiently detached from politics itself. Although there may be claims in the political sphere that are objective lies. Holmes himself, when introducing the marketplace of ideas metaphor, seemed to be thinking about normative beliefs more than factual beliefs. And their political beliefs are a species of normative belief. I think they're the harder case for thinking that any kind of chilling or censorial approach is going to be democratically or scientifically legitimate. So I guess I just see it as the most acute case of the tension that's threaded through this whole conversation. On the one hand, recognizing that free market type solutions are not going to work, and on the other hand, recognizing that we don't have the conditions in place to imagine regulatory solutions that would be could command any kind of broad social acceptance, unless we're talking about solutions that are at one remove, like a lot of what competition law, was just being invoked by Amy and Yochai, or the public broadcasting model or what have you. I hope doesn't feel like a dodge, but I guess I just don't see political speech as fundamentally different from all that we've been describing so much as an acute case.
I mean, one might think that the party, I was just thinking about the institutions of knowledge production. We might think that political parties have historically played a role in limiting the, this is a good story. One optimistic story would be that at least at some points in American history, the political parties have played a disciplining role when it comes to the production of political lies. And certainly First Amendment doctrine gives a lot of deference to the power of the party when it comes to organizing and disciplining its members and determining who's its candidate, who speaks for it. And we might think, one of the problems with, and so that might be the mediating institution that we might look to. I don't remember who said, one thing we might have to do about the problem of lies right now is reimagine the Republican Party. But that certainly seems a project that is difficult to imagine being organized through public law, through regulation, direct regulation.
Although there are plenty of Democrats who still, for a long time and probably to this day, believe that Russians stole the election for Trump. Spreading false political beliefs, for political gain is as old as the Republic and then some. It's a particularly protected category precisely for the reasons that it's the most attractive target. Shutting down the opponent because they're disseminating fake news is the excuse of every autocrat now in the world. So I do think that we are awash. Some of the worst forms of disinformation we have are the most protected category for the excellent reason of the anti-authoritarian element of the Constitution. Didn't you know that there are emails showing that Hillary Clinton's campaign ran a pedophilia ring out of a pizza parlor in D.C.? Is that not a political fact? 40-some% of Trump voters polled said they believed it. So of course political lies are central to the story. We wouldn't be talking and not worried about it if it was just about companies lying about the carcinogenic effects of cigarettes, or the fact that the opiates are good enough because you need to worry about pain, let alone that Americans of lower social economic status are dying at rates equivalent to developing countries. We should protect political speech more for precisely the reason that I said before. At some point, the government official deciding what is fake news and what isn't will be appointed by Donald Trump or an equivalent. We don't want to live in a society in which that's not super protected in a way that even the McConnell court won't be willing to go along.
Okay, one other question, also a toughie, I think, which is asking pragmatically and politically, how do we create new kinds of institutions in which people have trust? Or how do we create the politics that we are suggesting, a non-neoliberal politics, if under the conditions of the present, where we are working within the current environment, where people believe all the things that Yochai just suggested they believe? Are we going to be forced to rely on private solutions, or can government play a role? And if so, how? How are we going to get that government? How are we going to get the funding for public newspapers and all the good things that we are talking about today?
Amy?
Sure, give me that one. I mean, I think that it's not that we have nothing to draw upon. I mean, I think you can look at the current environment and say a lot of people believe completely false things, but you can also look at it and say, you know, the vast majority of Americans, particularly of a certain age, have gotten coronavirus vaccines, despite a whole ton of misinformation out there about coronavirus vaccines, right? And of course, there's all kinds of issues that would make us think there's a very sad and terrible story about vaccine misinformation, but still a lot of people who don't believe it and they get vaccinated, right? And people deeply trust their doctors, for example. And so, you know, we can sort of, I use that example because it's one I know well, right? That in fact, most people really do trust their doctors, and if their doctors talk to them about this, they're quite successful. And they also trust people in their communities. And if you pair a community leader with a scientist, it's actually not that difficult to make some headway on a question, even as polarized as that. Although I will say most of those studies come from a time when vaccines were not quite as polarized as they are now. So I think there are sources of strength to draw upon, because I think not all of our institutions are, without structures and resources. And I think we need to protect the ones that we have, which is a non-trivial problem. And we need to see if we can build political coalitions to strengthen, and sort of build these new institutions. And it is not easy. I mean, we're in a moment where the obvious sort of gridlock and anti-democratic design of our constitutional order it's a problem for our planetary survival. It's a problem for the survival of our democracy, and it's not obvious how particularly given how entrenched the sort of counter-democratic aspects of our lawmaking processes are, and then add to that the new McConnell Court, as Yochai likes to call it. There's enormous problems, but we do have, actually, I think, an array of institutions that are sufficiently trusted and that people actually do believe in, and I think of it as a project of building upon those, as well as building broader political coalitions to gain the kind of political power that you need to command majorities in deeply counter-majoritarian institutions, which is no real solution for you, but I think what I can offer on short notice.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that. I think the answer is political victories enough times, and particularly an alliance. No,
big victories, Yochai.
Big enough victories, because it's politically contested. But I think it's really important. I looked at Michael Luttig's New York Times op-ed the other day, and to see him writing about the necessity of everybody, the arch conservative judge talking about the threat to democracy coming from the Republican Party now. It's really important to try to.
Wow. I think Yochai's frozen. It's a shame. That was quite a dramatic moment. Hopefully we'll come back to him. We'll never know, perhaps, what's really important. We have 5 more. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. This has been a really fascinating panel, in part because, and I suppose I'm curious whether you agree with this characterization. The blog post suggests that the idea of counterspeech is an illusion. And the conversation has made me think that, in fact, that's not what some of you think. It's that the idea that counterspeech is best produced through market mechanisms and at an individual level is a mistake, which suggests a very different take on the First Amendment tradition, that there is something to this idea that the best remedy for speech is counterspeech. Because I think what's been so interesting about the conversation is none of you are calling for, instead of counterspeech, direct government regulation of truth and falsity, which is in the ordinary public discourse, that's the choice, right? You either have direct chilling of speech, direct government restriction, or you have counterspeech. It seems like all 3 of you have been suggesting something else, a form of counterspeech, but one that is produced differently than we are accustomed to understanding it. Right, wrong, yes, no?
I think I agree with a lot of that formulation. I would just say that the most effective counterspeech is the counterspeech that doesn't need to be said, in the sense that it's internalized by the speaker beforehand. So the business model itself doesn't reward the peddling of outrage or falsity, or and so the perhaps in part because of the counterspeech regime, that would make that less profitable or less palatable to readers. That could be a story you tell about the fairness doctrine, though I take all the points about how likely hard, if not impossible, to revive it under current conditions. So I guess I would just direct the attention away from counterspeech solutions that rely on the whack-a-mole, fact check here, warning label there, to defang particular lies, and think about counterspeech regimes at a more systemic level that will make it less profitable or likely that you're going to get lies from certain political institutions and media platforms. That kind of, but that brings us right into where we just were with the difficult, that means a much more fundamental project of social legislation, which brings into play all the forces that make it hard to get anything done under, in our current politics. And so in some sense, it just makes the problem harder. But that would be my gloss on what you just said, Genevieve, with which I largely agree.
Other final thoughts?
I was just going to add one thought, which is that I think, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the government does, in fact, regulate all kinds of speech in the commercial setting. And I'm quite comfortable with that. So including, you're not allowed to say that, no counter speech allowed here, right? We do that all the time. And I think many of us are comfortable with that. Where we're uncomfortable is getting back to the previous question, or maybe 2 questions ago, if you were to do that vis-a-vis core political speech. And I think that both goes to the sort of anti-authoritarian point that Yochai is talking about, and also to the question of how it is that counterspeech operates to allow people to feel heard and feel as participants, right? And that's a different value than getting to the truth of the matter. So I think, we just wanted to sort of emphasize that I think there's lots of places where we're actually quite comfortable with government saying no counterspeech here, not allowed. But that where it becomes difficult is precisely in these kind of core. But that said, I think we've also been talking about the fact that government does invariably regulate speech environments by regulating all of these institutions in various ways, creating, these incentives are available, these not. And so we do need to think about that more distal kind of regulation, even as it affects the speech environment, because it's already affecting the speech environment. So we should absolutely be thinking about sort of how the government design of incentives for institutions like Facebook operates to, facilitate or not. But that's a very different thing than sort of, here comes a law that says nobody's allowed to say vaccines are bad. which I wouldn't support, right? And so I think it's a matter of thinking about what kind of regulation, but even anticipating in the political realm that when we're regulating at a certain distance and trying to create structures that will be conducive and reflect our analysis of power relations and incentives and so forth, that's also okay. And I think we should be discussing that.
Johan, any final thoughts?
No, I think I had my fair share.
Okay, well, thank you so much for what has been a really wonderful and exciting conversation. And I guess I'll just say one other thing in response to Dave's last point, which is in some ways maybe recognizing that the problem is a hard one is depressing. And I've joked in earlier roundtables that every one of the roundtables in the Lies and Laws session are depressing. We're always very depressed. This has in some ways been the least depressing roundtable, surprisingly enough. But recognizing that a problem is hard maybe is better than thinking that there's an easy solution. And so I'm still going to have a non-depressing spin on it. But thank you, all three of you, for really a wonderful and rich conversation. And thanks, audience, for participating and for your questions. For those who found this conversation interesting, I just want to note that the Knight Institute is going to be having the year-end symposium in the Lies and Law project on the topic of lies, free speech, and the law. We're going to bring together 13 really amazing scholars to talk about various aspects of the problem at Columbia University in New York on April 7th and 8th. So we invite you to participate. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in April. Bye-bye.